Hello and welcome. My name is John Robichaux. I'm Director of Education at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, or HAI. Relevant to today's topic since 2006, I've also taught in the areas of democracy and international relations here at Stanford and at Harvard. It's my distinct honor today to serve as both host and moderator for this high special public event on one of the most important topics of our time, technology and democratic elections, with particular attention to the 2020 elections right before us. A few housekeeping items to get us started. Today's special event is hosted by Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI. Stanford High is dedicated to the study of human-centered artificial intelligence and related technologies as we together embark on what many are calling the age of AI. Through our research, policy, and education arms, High aims to ensure that the benefits of AI technologies are widely and justly shared while simultaneously reducing their harms. Today's public program fits into that mission in a particular way. As many of you know, High regularly has public forums where we discuss cutting-edge AI research out of Stanford and other institutions worldwide. We also have closed-door trainings, briefings, and programs related to AI and adjacent technologies concerning their real-world impacts for elected officials, policymakers, CEOs, executives, leaders in industry, philanthropic, nonprofit, and other leaders in civil society, as well as key communicators like global tech journalists, among many other populations. To learn more about those events, do visit our High website, sign up for our mailing list, and reach out to the High team with particular interests or inquiries that you may have. A third category, though, I want to underscore today is this relates to this event. These are issues that are of critical public interest. Not just issues that relate to AI, but also understanding artificial intelligence as part of a larger umbrella of issues around emerging technologies facing the public and that are rightly of keen public interest. So we hope that you enjoy and appreciate this event and others like it. Welcome your feedback on it in the coming days and hope to see you and many others for our public events and other related events going forward. A few technical matters. First of all, as an online event, we do acknowledge that sometimes there are technical difficulties that arise, so we do beg your patience should we encounter any of those in our time today. If we go down, please simply log back into the webinar and check the High events pages for updated info. For our chat feature today, the Zoom chat feature has been disabled, and we will be using the Slido feature for chat and for questions and answers. Note that Slido contains both a chat area for discussion and a Q&A area for your questions. As moderator, when I'm looking in Slido, I'll be emphasizing the Q&A section. So please do make sure your questions make it to the Q&A area and the chat, as the chat continues to fly by or often flies by. I wanted also to flag for those of you who are here today that our featured two speakers, Reich and Marietje Schaake, also have been writing issue briefs on today's topics, two of which are already published and available at the High website in the policy section. Technology's role in administering democratic elections and social media and political polarization are already available today as we speak, and there'll be two more coming available at the website here in the coming days. So keep an eye out for that, and you can use the QR code here to get to the website, both where they are today and to look for future events. You can also, future publications, you can also sign up there to be notified when they become available. Concurrent or companion event that High is offering to this event today will occur the day after polls close in the United States, November 4th. The info here is available on the slide, but please do go to the High website or use the QR code here to sign up for that. So this is an ongoing conversation as part of High's good work when it comes to issues of key political and public interest around democratic elections and technologies. Okay, with that said, let's get to it. Today's panelists, as you know, include prominent speakers in this area and folks who are teaching what is right now one of the largest courses here on campus, both for undergraduates and for adult continuing education learners here on Stanford in a combined format. They've agreed today to join us, and we're grateful for that for this hour. We understand that not everybody can make the full course, and so we're pleased today to have this time together. Rob Reich is professor of political science here at Stanford. He currently serves as associate director of HAI and director of the McCoy Center of Ethics and in Society. His new book, Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, edited with Lucy Bernholtz and Helene Landemore, will be published in December, so keep an eye out. Marietje Schaake served as a Dutch member of the European Parliament for 10 years, as founder of the European Parliament Intergroup on Digital Agenda for Europe, has served as an election observer in many places around the world. And today, she is, among many other things, HAI's International Policy Fellow, International Policy Director, and International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford. Lisa Einstein is a Stanford master's student in computer science and cyber policy and TAs the course here at Stanford. She knows this area very well. She works also at Stanford's Internet Observatory, which is a cross-disciplinary program here at Stanford dedicated to the study of abuse in current information technologies with a focus on social media. Lisa's also researched disinformation and ways to curb abuse on consumer internet services. And previously she taught physics in the Peace Corps' Let Girls Learn program in Guinea, West Africa. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today and looking forward to the discussion that we're about to have. To begin, I want to ask by asking you to set for us the historical context here. Historians of democracies will often tell you that technologies have always impacted democracy and democratic practices, that it's a fact of life and democracies constantly have to adjust to it. So we've now been in the current age of technological innovations around the internet for decades, and AI with wide or semi-wide distribution for not quite as long, but certainly for a number of years. So can you help us contextualize where we're at historically today in 2020? What is exactly the moment that we're living in?
I'll get us started on that very big picture question, John, but I think it is the right place to start, a kind of big picture context. If we take a capacious understanding of technology so that we're not just thinking about digital tools, but things more broadly, like the actual devices that we cast our ballot with at the polling station, those involve all kinds of technological innovations and discoveries if we harken back in time. And of course, the oldest amongst those technologies is simply casting your ballot with a red pencil or some type of punch hole device, and then the physical tallying of those ballots. Nowadays, we obviously have the digital capabilities of conducting an awful lot of what happens on election day in an online way. But I think it's notable to point out that in many places in the world, and indeed in the United States as well, we don't have universal online voting for the simple reason that it's very, very difficult to secure an online-only election contest. In other words, if there is a contested outcome or if there are questions raised about the legitimacy or authenticity of a count, in a digital-only environment, it's very hard to guarantee that you can have recourse to paper ballots in order to actually conduct a physical recount. And so despite our high-tech age, we still have what you might call a very low-tech education technology, election technology. And this doesn't get even into the questions about how it is that information and misinformation and disinformation circulates in an online way. We're just talking now about the actual conduct or administration of elections. And I'll gesture here at Marietje, who's served as an election observer in many different countries, and coming from the Netherlands as well, can talk about the situation outside the US.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everybody to our Stanford High event. I'm happy you're all joining on this moment where I think top of mind for everybody is the US election. But looking back in history a little bit, I think information and new technologies to share information or access information have always had a component of power. And they've often had the promise of disrupting existing structures of power. And in the case of new technologies, social media, mobile phones, that promise very much came along with the hope and expectation that individuals would be emancipated, that there would be a liberalizing effect. And that might explain why democratic governments, by and large, the United States, but many European countries as well, have had such a hands-off approach to intervening in the ongoing spread of these technologies. And I think if you ask what momentum are we facing now, is the tipping point where that laissez-faire, hands-off, don't regulate momentum is changing into a momentum of realization that the promise of liberalization, of the spread of freedom almost without, you know, any obstacles through the use of these new technologies would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The realization is that there is a lot of risk involved with not governing for democratic values, checks and balances, independent oversight, accountability. And so I imagine that if we look back to 2025 or 10 years from now, that we will see that it will start off a number of regulatory interventions. And I would hope that those regulatory interventions would put democracy first and not trust technology first.
Great. So thank you both. I think, you know, for many of us, we think about social media and disinformation, which is a topic I'm sure we'll get to at a certain, you know, throughout today's conversation. But I want to put some pins in some other technological topics that we ought to have in mind. So we hear a lot in the media about social media, disinformation, polarization, and the like. But what else ought we be paying attention to in 2020? What is sort of behind that loud cacophony that we may be blinded to because we're so focused on social media, disinformation, and the like?
I can interject with one thing. So I think that we underestimate the role that traditional media continues to play in the disinformation landscape. Mm-hmm. So for example, a lot of pressure was put on social media companies during the Hack and Leak campaign last week with, the campaign against Joe Biden and with Hunter Biden's information, when in fact, it was the New York Post that originally published that information. They published publicly identifiable information about the people in the emails. They did not wait for a campaign statement from Joe Biden before releasing the information. So I think we need to hold traditional media to account to a higher level than we're currently doing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rob, Marietje, what else ought we be paying attention to?
I'd point to a general dynamic that I think characterizes the digital age that puts us in a different moment. And I think this, for me at least, gets to the heart of some of the core concerns about the digital age as a general matter, and not just the election. And the advent of these digital tools and technologies has basically diminished the cost of producing and distributing information to other people to nearly zero. So even though Lisa's exactly right to point to the continuing importance of old age media, where there's an editor and a bunch of professional journalistic standards that really help to sort good information from bad information, our new age means that any of us with an internet connection or a mobile telephone can post text, images, video, and potentially distribute it to the world at basically zero cost without any editorial filter of any kind. So we have now what I would describe as a superabundance of information, and that circulates amongst us, leading to the need for search engines, leading to the need for algorithmic curation. These are part and parcel of the very tools that the companies that host the information do for us that didn't really exist in an earlier era. And so all of the problems, I think, are important to point to: the absence of filters, the absence of curation, the absence of editorial judgment from the standpoint of journalistic norms, but the presence of those curation and filters in an opaque way contained only within the companies, so that it's unclear to us on the outside, how is it that our news feed is constituted? How is it that our search results come about? Why is it different for different people? Those remain puzzles from the outside, even though this is the foremost way that our information environments are constituted. This is how we access and obtain information for the vast majority of people today.
Yeah, I would add to that the importance of what we don't see. And so that is about data, how data is collected about us. So it's not only about information coming our way, but also what can be analyzed, assembled, brokered, and shared about us and our most intimate details. But what's also invisible is, for example, the extent to which election technologies are properly protected or rather vulnerable. And it remains very, very difficult to have, for example, a harmonized set of stress tests across very different subsets of the states that are organizing the elections. It's hard sometimes to know who is responsible for attacks or manipulations or hacks. And so I would say we need to also look under the hood and ensure that there is accountability for either negligence to protect, and certainly when there's hacking or other kind of malign interference with the democratic rights of people, because that's what this is about. This is not so much about, you know, the one team you favor or the other candidate that you hope to win. I hope that the topic of democratic resilience, including the technological aspects, can remain a bipartisan point. And I think, especially in America now, that is a big challenge.
Great. Marietje, let me pick up on that last point, because I know you've been a huge advocate, and you mentioned it several times already, about regulating with democratic values in mind and the importance of having that be our lead around technology policy as a whole. But let's narrow it down on the election front. What would be some recommendations that you would have for those of us who are citizens advocating to our policymakers, for those in the audience who are policymakers? What would be some positive choices we could make that would help make a difference or make our elections more free, more fair, more just? So our mission, but also on the reducing harm side, what are some recommendations we should really not listen to, or maybe stay away from, even though they may sound tempting to us?
Yeah, so I'm glad you bring up the topic of regulation. It is often portrayed as if Europeans are very eager to regulate tech firms, and the US is much more reluctant in that sense. But it's important to know that tech companies themselves are making a lot of decisions that are really crucial. You could say they govern over enormous online spaces and what is allowed to be said there, what speech is prioritized, the way in which information gets shared or does not get shared. And so it's been a remarkable year for anyone who has focused on tech policy, and especially social media policy, because I recall the days where almost every question about regulating social media companies was answered with a reference to the First Amendment of the US Constitution, only to say that it would be very difficult to change anything to the existing business models, because this was all about speech. And what's interesting now is that tech platforms, look at Facebook, Twitter, I think after a lot of push, also YouTube has made some decisions. In any case, the policy decisions coming out of the tech companies far exceed the policy decisions coming out of democratic governments. And I've been one of the people who have long said that tech companies should take responsibility for the power that they have. But primarily, I would like to see democratic governments setting the limits of, for example, where free speech ends and what exceptions should exist, but also in terms of transparency and accountability, so that if company A, B, or C claims that they are curating or taking down information for a certain reason, like hate speech or calls for violence, that it can be independently verified. And so I think independent oversight and accountability are important. And because we're a university, that would include independent research. So more external eyes over the already very powerful platforms and the policy decisions that they make.
But I did also hear you lead with, and there's a groundswell of things that are happening on the tech side, which is on the one hand welcome, but on the other hand not nearly enough of where you'd like us to be.
Right. I mean, I think it's the wrong order to have companies basically regulating themselves. But I also think that right now, weeks before the election, to have an avalanche of policy initiatives taken by the tech companies makes it really hard to have a sense of what their real impact is. And it has already created a lot of confusion. You know, building on what Lisa has said, you know, should the New York Post article have been available or not available on social media platforms? If the social media companies say that they're going to not make it available, do they succeed? I think the success factor of following through on their own corporate policies is actually very, very bad. And we have to understand why. Is it not possible to take down information anymore? Is there not enough resources dedicated to it? You know, what is the problem here? So there have been some decisions made, for example, the fact that Facebook has finally decided to do something about Holocaust denial, and that there have been steps taken by both Facebook and Twitter vis-a-vis far-reaching conspiracy theories that could endanger public safety, I think are welcomed, but we still need to independently verify the success rates of following through on those stated decisions from the companies themselves.
Can I hop in here on this? I want to add something to Marietje's comments about what the tech platforms are doing, because John, as you rightly said, we've seen a burst of activity in the past year from the tech platforms to try to grapple with the obvious problems that beset us in the online environment. And I think it's important to distinguish amongst a variety of different approaches that the tech companies are taking, and then also that regulators can imagine taking up and examining, as well as academics taking up and studying. So on the one hand, we've seen the efforts of the tech companies to foreground and to insert into our news feeds authoritative information that is either scientifically based, say, about the coronavirus, or about simple facts about the election. Here is the day on which the election is going to happen. Here's how to register. Things that aren't partisan at all. And this isn't a matter of content being produced and posted. This is the company deciding to insert paternalistically, as it were, this authoritative information. And the companies have been far more proactive on that front in the past year than they had been previously. Second, apropos, you know, this event being hosted by HAI, the volume of content that people post on these platforms and that can circulate in very short amount of time is just far beyond the capacity of any human moderator to take stock of. So we're forced to rely at the companies and elsewhere on automated moderation approaches, which is to say the deployment of various forms of artificial intelligence in order to detect potentially problematic content and then to take action on it. We can't wait for an independent third-party fact checker to examine every piece of information that goes up online in order to prevent it from going viral. And so there has to be some significant effort on automated approaches. Third, and the last thing I'll say is that, you know, the debate about free speech that Marietje mentioned is exactly the correct way to frame the conversation. But it's important to note that we ought not believe, either as engineers who work at the tech companies or as public policy regulators or as ordinary citizens, that we face a kind of binary choice. Either we leave the information up that gets posted, or we delete it and ban it and take it down. There are a whole host of other approaches that we can take, all within the context of free expression, that involve, say, diminishing the viral spread of information, so slowing down the distribution of potentially problematic information, adding context to information that's posted. And we see that now with the various tech companies who add various disclaimers or sort of block the immediate access to information, slow down our retweets or sharing of the information, that type of thing. And I think one of the most important agendas for citizens, for us to understand what these platforms are doing, is to make progress on the steps that fall shy of deleting or banning content, and imagining a whole new array of approaches to thinking about the sharing and distribution of information that get at the context and slowing down the viral spread and helping to provide additional means of up-ranking or down-ranking authoritative information.
Great. Great. I want to turn to the international context, but I'm going to pause for a moment and ask or make a reminder to those who are participating to please put your questions in the Q&A section of Slido that's provided here. We'll turn to audience questions here in the next couple minutes as well. So get them in now, and I'll be looking through them shortly. But we would be remiss, given all the international experience that's represented on this panel, if we didn't take a bigger view, at least for a few moments, because we have been talking about tech companies as a whole. We've been thinking, with some U.S. elections in mind, and maybe a few topics that fit, internationally and in other places beyond just the U.S. as well. So we've sort of touched on a few places, but if we were to narrow in on maybe lessons learned in the international context, because the 2020 U.S. election is not the birthplace of many of these troubles or concerns, or maybe even, victories, right? That we ought to be holding up. And Marietje and Lisa, I know, I know everybody, Rob inclusive, has experience in this world, but Marietje, you've been an election observer and a commentator on this for many years. Lisa, of course, out of Internet Observatory, may have some comments as well. So tell us a little bit about what we in the United States ought to understand about elections more broadly with regard to AI-related technologies and the like.
Well, I honestly wish that Americans would have learned more from elections abroad, where social media, disinformation, private chat groups, rumor spread, election violence, polarization, hacking attempts were already taking place. I think there is often in the United States way too much of a US-centric view, both on what the tech platforms are doing and what they should be doing. And I understand, because they're so dominant, it's easy to, have a sort of close relation between lawmakers and corporate leaders, and often there is this kind of revolving door. But the reality is that the bulk of users of social media platforms reside outside of the United States. And that oftentimes the context within which elections take place is much more fragile, including where lives of people are on the line, ethnic violence, voter repression, cracking down on, for example, peaceful demonstrators or opposition figures, etc. So I would really hope that, however important these US elections are, that as soon as possible, the view extends to a global one again, and that we really think about the global implications of these American companies, and that there's also more investment by these billion-dollar companies in other parts of the world to prevent the worst of the worst outcomes that are directly linked to the spread of rumors, incitements to violence, ethnic tensions, and whatnot. And we can see very, very lively examples of that in Myanmar. Despite lessons learned in the past, still a lot of problems with hate speech on a platform like Facebook. But I would also say lessons learned in a country like Kenya, where private chats like WhatsApp, which is now also owned by Facebook, were also platforms where hatred and rumors were spread, and it made it much harder to even have a sense of where people got their information and why they would show up in public squares with arms, for example. So there's a lot that can be learned from the rest of the world, and I think it will be important for the United States to also appreciate that democracy is fragile, even in one of the most powerful democracies in the world, and it has to be protected explicitly and not assumed to be resilient enough in and of itself.
So I'll just add on to that there, I hope that all of the attention doesn't even just stay on the US election now, because there are elections happening all over the world. Just this Sunday in Guinea, where I had served with the Peace Corps, there was a very contentious election, and 24 hours ago, the opposition leader came to Facebook and claimed victory prematurely, which is something I know in the US we're all paying a lot of attention to. And the platforms actually have very clear policies on this, specifically Facebook and Twitter, where he posted. But as of today, there are 6.2 thousand comments and 2.9 thousand shares and no labeling at all. So I think that it's really dangerous to focus all of our attention on the US election when this is really a global issue. And I have friends that are hiding in their houses now before fear of ethnic violence. So I really hope that people are going to be paying attention to these elections at the same time. I also want to just add on to what Rob mentioned about automated content moderation, which becomes complicated in the global context when, for example, translation in various low resource languages where people may be sharing misinformation and inciting content is not going to be picked up by the algorithms. The languages that are going to be picked up by the algorithms are English, French, the top 50 or 100 languages that Google Translate has had the opportunity to work on, both because there's a lot of data and because there's a lot of engineers who know those languages, because that's where they come from. So I think we really need to take a more global view of these things and walk with caution into locations where maybe the standard of care may not be developed yet, and maybe not worry so much about growth in those contexts until you can provide the same standard of care.
Lisa, your work at the Stanford Internet Observatory concerns social media and disinformation and the like. I know that you've thought about synthetic media and other topics of this kind. Can you sort of elaborate maybe a little bit more about the work of the Internet Observatory on this subject with regard to elections that we ought to have in mind? And then after this, I'll turn to the audience questions.
Sure. Well, I think it's interesting to note that the growth of synthetic media, whether it's GPT-3, which is OpenAI's language that can make language generator that can make language that sounds like it's real information, so that has implications for disinformation, or whether it's deep fakes. It seems like you actually don't need that much complex AI to change people's opinions about people. You can just edit a couple of videos of Joe Biden pausing between phrases, and suddenly you see that he, maybe, I'm sure you could edit video of me talking right now with my ums and whatever, and I'd probably look pretty silly. So I think it's not that hard to, see, there you go, to make people, to question people's competence through the use of media. I think the way that this is going to be used, and this is something I've learned from Alex Stamos and from Renee DiResta at the Internet Observatory. First of all, you're no longer going to need a bunch of native speakers to flood comment sections to make something seem viral. So for example, a lot of Russian disinformation was found because you could see their small, English errors or something like that. But if you have something that you can just generate this automatically, you can make, 1,000 plausible pro-Trump comments, and there's no telltale signs that it's inauthentic. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. I think the other thing to keep an eye out for is just giving people plausible deniability for saying, oh, I never said that. That was a deep fake. So imagine Trump coming out in 2016 and saying, that wasn't me in that Access Hollywood video. That was just, some synthetic media. So I think that's going to be used a lot. And we saw, for example, with the Macron leaks in 2017, the mixing of real and fake media. So this all leads to this heightened awareness by our society of disinformation, which plays right into our adversaries' hands. So it's exactly what people who want us to mistrust democracy want, is for us to, I think it was Podesta who said, when nothing is real, everything, or when nothing is real, anything can be real, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So.
Good. That's great. So I want to thank you all for the exciting conversation to this point. We want, because we have many hundreds of folks in the audience today, we would love to get some questions in from the audience as well. A reminder to those of you who just joined us, please do submit your questions via the Q&A option in Slido, and I'll be monitoring those. Obviously, we won't get to everyone, but we will we'll do our best here. Okay, the first question I want to bring up actually goes all the way back to the first comment that Rob made, the first theme around online elections and the possibilities of online elections, because we are seeing online elections internationally, or fully digital elections. And a few folks have asked the question along the lines of, hey, look, we give all kinds of sensitive information, our banking information, personal information, through presumably encrypted or really encrypted platforms, banking being obvious, probably others we could come up with, healthcare and the like. Is it really so different to be thinking about having an election through an online platform, or how ought we be thinking about that? And I will open that up.
Marietje, maybe you can take that and talk about the experience in the Netherlands that you shared with respect to considerations of these online technologies for voting.
Yeah, no, I think in general, it is technically possible. But I think there is always a need to have a verification trail. So for example, a paper trail to check against how the digital process went. In the Netherlands, where I am now, because of the executive order banning Europeans from traveling to the US, we still vote with pencils and paper. And nobody is really concerned because there's high levels of trust. And similarly, I've seen the push in other countries to actually go completely digital because people presumed that that would extend the trust where it was otherwise lacking. And oftentimes you'll find that technology is not a substitute for trust. And so you really need a verification method, principally, but also to build trust. And I think that that may also be one of the outcomes of the process of the elections in the US. So irrespective of who may be the winner, that the trust as it gets lower requires more verification. And I'm generally agnostic about which medium is used as long as it can be verified, as long as it can be stress tested. And I simply think that there are still too many known glitches with a lot of the technologies, or the budgets are not made available to actually go for the highest standards in order to actually go for digitized elections in the United States at the moment, for example.
If there's no other comment, I'm happy to jump in with the next question. Great. So we hear this a lot when we talk about technology in the elections. We hear when we talk about social media, disinformation in the elections. Hey, look, there's been a problem misinformation, for decades, for centuries, perhaps. I think we would probably say centuries, the historians in the room. What is truly different? The questioner references radio propaganda in Germany and Italy before World War II, TV, of course, during the Cold War. Now we've got social media and the like. I think, previously you mentioned speed is of absolute importance. Rob, you mentioned the fact that there's a low barrier to entry into those conversations that really has changed things. Are there other real differences we ought to think about there?
Yeah, well, I'll point to at least two, but it's important to emphasize, just as you did, John, or just as the questioner did, that misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, as old as electioneering is, this has always been a feature that's with us. What's different is the digital infrastructure now that is so ubiquitous that all of us basically connect to, that allow for a different kind of information environment that didn't exist previously. So let's imagine, the quintessential crazy uncle who has some, wacky conspiracy theory about how it is that something is affecting this particular policy or this particular, election issue, whatever it happens to be. In an earlier era, that crazy uncle could have shown up on the street corner outside the subway stop in the public park with a bunch of billboards and screamed his or her, his conspiracy theory to the world. Could have written a letter to the editor of a newspaper, could have perhaps, if the person had been rich, bought time on a television show or a radio program to try to post his craziness as advertising. But the reach of that conspiracy theory was basically limited under the old environment. Whether there was journalistic standards that were fact-checking things that would be published, or just because of the way that the infrastructure worked, you couldn't guarantee yourself the reach of what global platforms now allow. If I have some crazy ideas about what's going on in the Netherlands, about which I know very little, I could probably find a way to insert my ill-founded, fact-free speculations about the Netherlands into some of the online discourse. That simply wasn't possible for people before the internet and social media came about. That's why we have this superabundance of information, and why the tools for sorting information, good from bad, are now so important. Misinformation, disinformation, not new, but the ease of reach, of distribution, and the viral properties that cross borders so easily, that's the novel arrangement that we have before us today.
Okay. And so a skeptic hearing this should not hear you say, boy, the ability to get your message out, more broadly is a terrible thing. The real crux of the concern here is separating the moderation pieces are absolutely essential.
That's right. The positive way to describe the situation is that we've had an incredible democratization of voice. Now everyone is a potential reporter or a witness. The videos we see of police brutality and violence in the United States, many of them are generated through the cell phone accounts of bystanders who then post them quickly afterwards. That's a new form of accountability for the police departments, and has given important rise to hashtag activism, Black Lives Matter, Me Too type things, which are all a part of the same type of environment that I've described. So that the hard task before us is harnessing these tools for our benefit and then mitigating the downside risks that are also part and parcel of the new system.
Great to Lisa. Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay. I think Rob, you mentioned there the Black Lives Matter movement, which touches on a few comments, a few questions that folks have had here. Let's foreground elections and inequality. And look, whether it's the disinformation campaigns, whether it's the moderation, whether it's the linguistic problems that Lisa mentioned earlier, there are probably 1,000 other ways in which we could describe, technology and the democratic processes being impacted, and particularly impacting most vulnerable populations or excluded populations, underrepresented populations. What are the sort of the key factors we want to think about if we want to really be driving more towards what we say is our mission, which is a more just, more equally shared society, and really combat those inequalities that are only exacerbated by the technologies we see. So maybe what they are, and then as you see them, and then how we might think about them or address them.
Well, I'll hazard a quick first response to that, and I'm really keen to hear what Lisa and Marietje have to say too. For those of you watching, and you see the Zoom backgrounds for some of us here with HAI and human-centered artificial intelligence, you might be wondering, what really is the alternative to a human-centered AI? A robot-centered AI, a machine-centered AI, and possibly that's an imaginable approach, but at the heart of this approach at HAI, and at the heart of what I think our task is more generally as citizens, is to bring the full resources of our broader democratic institutions to bear on how it is to get the best out of technology and to limit the risks that go along with them. And that's not new. That's not new to AI. That's not new to digital tools and platforms. That's as old as technological innovation happens to be. And so when I think about the kind of big picture problems that I want to work on over a longer time horizon, far beyond the November 3rd election, it's how to imagine infusing a democratic sensibility and a set of robust democratic ideals into how we collectively build and steward our future. And all of this is taking place, let's of course name this, within a geopolitical contest between democracies and authoritarian regimes. It's never been more important than to establish the bona fides, the robustness and the capacity of democratic institutions and societies to govern well. And so technologists have an important role to play in that. And they should be harnessed to that task as well. So it's not just that we want democracy to regulate, democratic institutions to regulate what technologists do. We want technologists to feel like there's a role for them to play in supporting and promoting democratic institutions, because that's the global geopolitical context in which we all live.
Mm-hmm. Marietje, let me ask, because I think we were recently in a conversation with a tech executive who said something to the effect of, "Hey, listen, I understand the competition that Rob just mentioned between democratic societies and more authoritarian societies, and the splintering of the internet's coming." And one of his key takeaways was, maybe it would be better if we find a way to live in the one internet world where, in order to make sure that we can bring along, maybe some more democratic ideals in the authoritarian societies, perhaps having to sacrifice a few democratic goals, so that long term we can have a more useful internet for a lot of reasons. Now, he may have had corporate and consumer interest in mind. We want to think on elections and free exchange of ideas, potentially for elections. But I guess I'm wondering, you've been a big voice for the democratic values that we mentioned earlier. how do you deal with the fact that, there are these advocates who say maybe there is a one-way system, and, maybe the democracies can learn a little, as one of the questioners said, potentially from China, with a little more moderation of this free superabundance of ideas?
Yeah, so I think that the vision of a global internet that would, you know, lean towards democratic values is a beautiful vision. I truly believe that a lot of the pioneers that were building the technologies, the network of networks, the World Wide Web, really built it with that vision in mind. But the ideal of the open internet has already been broken by sovereignty-driven, top-down, control-oriented state policies. And so if you have, on the one hand, authoritarian states instrumentalizing technology, their grip on the internet for their own power, not a democratic agenda. And on the other hand, you have democratic governments essentially doing very little to safeguard those democratic principles. Then profit-built systems are setting the terms. And I don't necessarily blame companies for seeking profit. I think that they are doing what room they're given, right? But if we go back to those vulnerable populations that you mentioned, and that I think are extremely important, we have vulnerable populations within our societies. Think about minorities, and obviously Jewish people suffer when Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism go viral on social media platforms, or people impersonating as Black Lives Matters events and activists only to sow more discord and polarization. But also the repression of people and the trampling on their human rights are examples that we've seen that have been assisted by social media. And so while there's a lot of positive things that we could say about, giving people a voice, allowing people to organize online, etc., we cannot assume the best outcomes. And I think that what we see in common between the vision for one global internet and the vision of an unregulated set of technologies bringing freedom per se is that we now know that it's not without deliberately governing for the protection of vulnerable populations, their human rights, building in safeguards, that it's going to manifest. And one thing that I think we urgently need is to be allowed by the tech companies to learn more from what they know. It is kind of sad that in the public interest, it's really hard to find out what the real impact is of manipulation, of polarization, of spreading disinformation and trying to get people to take to the streets, possibly use violence. Maybe we're hyping it. I would give that to the platforms who say it's not that bad, but the executives there have a view, the engineers there have a view that lawmakers, regulators, journalists, and academics don't have. And if we want evidence-based policies, which I think should be our ambition, then we need to also understand more of what the real effects are. And then I would hope that with better information, we can also better safeguard the most vulnerable and make democracy more resilient.
I'll just add to what Rob and Marietje said, and share that there's a trend of professional media agencies and the use of the internet to manipulate the political environment to the benefit of the dominant ethnic group or political party. And maybe we don't see that quite as much in the US, but it's very prevalent in other countries. There have been examples recently of PR firms named in takedowns all around the world, in Egypt and Ukraine and Brazil. And we need to pay attention to this. And it's actually a question that we all need to grapple with. What does it look like to have a legitimate political campaign in the 21st century? Because like, for example, if there was an organization that was loosely affiliated with a US political campaign that pays teenagers to post supportive messages all over social media, what should the company do? Do we think this is okay? Does this sit right with us in our democracy? What if it's a foreign power paying? And I think these are questions that don't have clear answers yet. And they're things that we need to think about. I mean, I can go to a mall and hand out flyers, and maybe sometimes I'll be working for a campaign and they'll pay me. How is it different if I'm actually being paid to post an ad? And is it different if I support that political candidate? Is it different if I actually don't, but I need some money? So I think these are big questions that we need to grapple with right now.
Great. Okay, for the next two questions, I'm going to take far ends of the spectrum. One is at the governmental level, one is at the individual level, both from the Q&A questions that have been submitted by the audience. Audience, you've got about 9 more minutes to submit more questions if you would like. The first one is really is a question about middle powers in the international sphere. So, listen, I mean, Marietje, from Europe, we've long looked at have long complained or looked at the US. We've heard voices out of Europe saying, hey, look, the US has too much control over what's happening on the internet because so many of the companies are based here. I think in California, we feel particular, and certainly at Stanford, we feel particular responsibility for what happens out of Silicon Valley, given our location, given our influence in that world. But so, we've got the US, we've got, California, we've got the Valley, sort of, as the major powers, let's say, in the conversation. But there's a whole middle ground of middle powers. And the example that the questioner offers is Canada. But there are plenty of others that we could identify. What can a middle power realistically do to address issues around platform governance, given that these countries, given that the companies are concentrated in the States, and then, of course, the ongoing tensions between the U.S. and European approaches to governance right now of privacy, the internet, data, the like.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start quickly. One, I think the middle powers, if they are like-minded, so if we build on the example of Canada, we could say Canada is largely like-minded with European nations, for example, but also, Japan, Australia. India is a very important power, not so much maybe a middle power because it's a significant country, but not always fully in line with the strong democracies of this world. I think it's important that countries work together better along shared values, and I hope values are interests, but could also be shared interests. So that would be the first answer. Second answer on the tensions between the US and the EU, sure, I think it hasn't necessarily gotten easier in recent years, but I also see convergence. I mean, today, another antitrust investigation in Google was announced. We have 47 attorneys general investigating. There are a lot of talks. I mean, we hear the president of the United States himself talking about eliminating Section 230, meaning liability exemptions for social media platforms. Now, it has never gotten to that in Europe at all. There may have been individual voices, but not nearly as powerful as the president of the United States. So I think that it may well be that the US is catching up fast and that we will see many more regulatory initiatives coming from the US than from Europe, even if that is counterintuitive at the moment. But ideally, I hope that the differences between democracies or like-mindeds can be overcome and that there can be a larger level playing field, which will actually help the companies in the end. That's the irony of it. If they have predictable shared standards across multiple jurisdictions, it will make it easier for them, and citizens in large parts of the world can be better protected.
Anybody else want to jump in on middle powers? Otherwise, I'm going to go to individuals. All right.
Talk about individuals.
All right. Next question, and it's a key question for all of us citizens in the world. What on earth can we individual citizens do who aren't government regulators, who aren't elected officials? What ought we be thinking about, in our day-to-day activities and the like? And then the final question I'll ask after that is, what have we missed or not talked about that you definitely want us to send us off with? So let's start with the individuals. What can we do as individuals to do right by in this world we've described?
I'll take an initial crack at that, and Lisa, curious if you have anything to say about that as well. So I want to take a short time horizon and then a longer time horizon. The short time horizon is leading up to November 3rd. What can individuals do between now and November 3rd, beyond the obvious, which is to go out and vote if you're eligible to do so? So just as Lisa described before about the case that's unfolding right now in Guinea, we in the United States face an election environment in which there's some possibility that the election will be so close that there will be competing interests trying to use the communication possibilities of Twitter and Facebook and other social media to shape our perceptions about what's going on completely divorced from the actual fact of the matter. This is why we've gotten the conversation up and running about, should media companies report on candidates declaring premature victory rather than elected officials, election officials reporting on the outcome of the election. Maybe we as citizens need to get used to the idea that for this election, the actual results may not be known until November 4th. Now, this puts us in an especially precarious environment, because in an environment in which there are going to be poll observers, poll watchers, citizen militias perhaps out in the streets, National Guard perhaps called out to monitor the possible eruption of violence in a contested environment. I think we in the United States are at a point of vulnerability to violence in the wake of an election that we haven't seen in the past decades. So what can individuals do? Individuals can do everything they can to maintain some stability and order, and to insist upon reliance upon election officials rather than declarations by candidates or the people who are doing business for the candidates. But then I want to say something about the longer time horizon. It's always important to ask questions about what can any individual do. However, one thing that some discourse will sort of prime you to think is that the kind of solution to this problem is to grayscale our color smartphones, or to delete Facebook, as if these are the only things that we can do in the face of the deterministic march of technological progress. That's exactly what I want to resist. Stop seeing over the long time horizon, the only thing that any individual can do is to twiddle with the settings on their phones, or to use a different browser, or in fact, just to try to abstain from the internet in some way. The much better solution is to think not as a consumer, but as a citizen, and to help shape the broader environment at the local level, the state level, the federal level, and indeed the global level, and to make your voice heard in various ways, not just at the election booth, so that we collectively shape our technological future rather than just give it over to the people who are the engineers who are going to create it one way or another.
Individuals, Marietje, Lisa, anything we ought to have in mind or we ought to be thinking about that Rob hasn't mentioned?
I'll just add, though, I love what you said, Rob. I think we really need to hold ourselves to a high standard in the way that we use our social media. So read the article before you share it. And if you have a disagreement with someone, pick up the phone and call them and have a conversation about it. I think Rob mentioned in our week on echo chambers and polarization that 100 years ago, parents were likely to be flabbergasted if you were planning to marry someone from another race, if there were an interracial marriage. And now the people are flabbergasted if you plan to marry someone who's from a different political party than you. I think that's a real problem, and it's something that we individually can work on by reaching out across the aisle and having conversations with people that we disagree with and feeling uncomfortable in those conversations. I know that's something that I'm really trying to do, and I hope that everyone else will do as well.
Yeah, maybe one last thought to close us off, because I think time has flown by. But I mean, I think educating people is really important. It's actually one of the reasons why we're teaching this course to people of all ages from outside of Stanford and students at Stanford. And we're really trying to demystify some of the ways in which technology does and does not work, to give people better ability to read and understand what is said about the impact of tech platforms and their policies. But I also think there's a risk that citizen or internet user education or digital skills becomes a trap. Because I still think that the difference in agency between an individual, however well educated they are, and I really try myself, but I still find it really hard to pierce through the legally completely polished terms of use that are constantly changing, and the design decisions that make it much easier for me to press one button over another, and things like that. So while I think education is always important on any topic, not just on technology, I do not think that it's possible for individuals to carry the agency to really counterweight the huge power of tech companies, and that therefore regulation to put safeguards in place and independent oversight and accountability will be necessary.
I have to add to that, because I agree so emphatically with what Marietje just said. I am a former 6th grade teacher. My own scholarly training was at a school of education. And what I learned partly through being a school teacher and partly at the School of Education was that every social ill, everything that ails a society at some point gets dumped on the backs of school teachers, often in the elementary school, as if there's a literacy campaign for every possible problem in society. School teachers have enough work to do already with the basics of what's going on in reading, writing, and arithmetic, that putting the problem of social media on their back through a digital literacy campaign is not merely foolhardy, it's insulting to what the actual task is of being a school teacher.
Okay. As a former teacher myself, I can appreciate that. So let me say thank you. We're at the hour. I want to thank the panelists for their time today. An incredible set of conversations. Clearly, never able to cover all the topics we might have taken up in the hour. And so, again, I'll remind you that both Marietje and Rob have helped us author some issue briefs around the election, which are available at the HI website on the policy pages. So take a look for the documents there. For those who are interested in continuing the conversation with HI, we will be having that November 4th event, the day after the U.S. election polls close, to talk more about what the state of the election here in the U.S. is, but also, we always touch on broader issues when we do so. And a reminder to please, if you haven't already, do visit us at the Stanford High website and join our email list. And what a pleasure to be here with all of you and all of you in the audience here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.